Welcome back to Everything History for episode 30, Caesar Reborn. That title may seem odd now, but in this episode, Octavian arrives in Rome and enters politics in order to claim the legacy of his adopted father, Julius Caesar. Thus, Octavian in this episode begins his long journey to becoming reborn in the eyes of Rome as Octavian Caesar.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Now, I finished the previous episode with two things: the reading of Julius Caesar's will that declared Octavian his son, and the decision by the Roman Senate to not declare the death of Julius Caesar a tyrannicide. But something I did not mention about that latter decision was that it was coupled with another decree, a decree that gave amnesty to all the assassins of Caesar. Also, as previously detailed, the decision to abstain from declaring the assassination a tyrannicide was a way of preventing an uprising and preventing another civil war, but it also created great tension between the supporters of Caesar and the supporters of Brutus and Cassius. Tensions that everyone expected to erupt into a civil war, or at least mass riots, at any moment. And it is in that tension that I begin today. But before I do, I wanted to notify you of what sources I will be consulting and using for my history of Augustus Caesar. I will be relying chiefly on primary sources and avoid citing secondary sources unless they have particularly interesting points. The chief authors I will be using will be Plutarch, Suetonius, Tacitus when available, Appian, Augustus himself, and several others when pertinent. When I quote them, I will introduce them by author, and if you have any questions on these sources, feel free to email me at everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com. All of the ancient sources are in the public domain and available online. I encourage you very much so to read them. I thought I would start up again with a quotation from Augustus himself. Quote, "In my 19th year, on my own initiative and at my own expense, I raised an army with which I set free the state, which was oppressed by the domination of a faction." End quote. That is from the Res Gestae of Augustus, meaning the achievements of the divine Augustus, which was written shortly before his death in 14 CE. It's essentially a short autobiography. Now, I wanted to linger a few moments on that statement because that is exactly where Augustus begins his own description of his own life. So why does it begin at the age of 19? Well, for the Romans, you became an adult, officially, around the age of 16, give or take a few years, depending on the historical context. So for that reason alone, it makes sense for Octavian to have begun his life story at 19. But that cannot be the whole story, because many Roman historians begin far before, when Octavian was a child, or with a description of his ancestry. So why else would Octavian begin at the age of 19? Well, it's because it was at the age of 19 that he became the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and Octavian wanted to be known as the son of Caesar. Therefore, everything before that point was simply a distraction, and not worth mentioning. Now, returning to 44 BCE, Octavian received word of Caesar's death while in northern Greece studying the art of Roman warfare, studies that he was sent to do by Caesar himself because the young Octavian was meant to be a commander in one of Caesar's campaigns against Parthia. So when Octavian received the news, he had a choice to make: go to Italia and enter upon a public life in the name of Caesar, or stay in Greece until everything blew over. To secure his safety, his family pleaded for him to stay in Greece, but our young Octavian was confident and decided immediately to step into the shoes of his father, the elder Caesar. Thus Octavian sailed for Italia to the city of Brundisium. Why is this bold? Well, Octavian was not yet the son of Caesar. Officially, it needed to be ratified by the Senate, which means Octavian was almost the richest and most influential man in the Roman Republic. But at the moment, Octavian was without money, without soldiers, and without leverage in Roman politics except for the word and name of Caesar. So suffice it to say, he had a big target on his back. Now, as Octavian sailed across the Adriatic, he began to develop a plan. And the Roman historian Appian tells us that he sailed for Brundisium with his good friend Marcus Agrippa, also an important figure in the story. Meanwhile, back in Rome, things were getting interesting. Quite interesting because in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, there were 4 chief groups: the people and the populace of Rome, the Senate, the conspirators, and there was also Marc Antony. Allow me to explain what each of these 4 groups were doing in the month or so after Caesar's horrific death. Group number 1, the populace of Rome and the nearby area, was in a frenzy. In March and April of 44, they frequently rioted in the name of Caesar. They distrusted the Senate and wanted the heads of the conspirators, who they referred to as traitors. Group number 2, the Senate, was in a tumultuous position because they supported the conspirators but could not do so openly. And they also had to manage everything that Caesar had left at the time of his death, which was quite a lot. The third group were the conspirators. The main conspirators I will be referencing are Marcus Junius Brutus, Gaius Cassius, and Decimus Brutus. Now the sources tell us, chiefly Appian, Suetonius, and Tacitus, that the Senate, in secret, referred to them as liberators for their murder of Caesar. I will not oblige to call them liberators, however, so I will simply refer to them as conspirators. Another interesting note about these chief conspirators was that Julius Caesar had thought them to be friends and allies. So much so that Caesar had decreed upon all 3 of them provincial governorships. The historians Appian and Plutarch tell us that Marcus Brutus was to govern Macedonia, Cassius was given Syria, and Decimus Brutus was awarded Cisalpine Gaul. Those appointments by the late Caesar will become important in just a moment. The 4th group I mentioned was actually just a man, Marc Antony. Antony is absolutely vital to the history of Rome and the tale of Octavian Caesar. The two had a very interesting relationship because in a short amount of time, Antony and Caesar would become enemies, friends, and then enemies again. Now, who is Marc Antony, and what is he doing in the month or so after Julius Caesar's death? Well, Marc Antony was actually born a plebeian, but he was nevertheless from a very affluent family, and at this point in the Republic, there was not a great amount of class distinction, based on birth at least. He was of senatorial rank, meaning he was a senator, and he had gained great distinction as a Roman soldier. He served under Julius Caesar and was raised to the rank of general while campaigning in Gaul with Caesar. By all accounts, Antony was an exceptional soldier and a very charismatic commander, a true army man, if you will, and his soldiers loved him for it. Yet he was also prone to debauchery, drunkenness, and overt violence. His patron god was Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, revelry, and madness, which might tell you something about his personality. And Plutarch tells us that even in his early days, Antony was especially prone to long stages of drunkenness. These character flaws, as we see them, will be important to this story when Octavian begins to exploit them. Despite his flaws, though, Antony was an incredibly charismatic and powerful Roman general and senator after Caesar's death. So what was Antony doing after Caesar's assassination? Well, Antony was still a consul of Rome, and he used his executive position to secure both his livelihood and his career. And he did so by cooperating, at first, with the Senate. For example, Antony and the Senate cooperated to verify all of Caesar's previous acts. For this was in the interest of everybody because it pleased the people, it secured Antony's position as consul, and all the conspirators could maintain their future governorships and other governmental positions. Thus the Senate and Antony passed that measure, but Antony also seized all of the records and documents of the late Caesar. Why, you ask? Well, it was a power move because that meant that only he had access to and knew the full extent of Caesar's writings, finances, and litigations. It also meant that Antony held control of the official copy of Caesar's will, which was not yet ratified by the Senate, meaning the young Octavian would need to go through Antony if he wanted any sort of legal power. It was also during this time that Marc Antony called in his soldiers to put down any riots, violence, or demonstrations against the Senate, himself, or even the conspirators. The Senate was surprised by Antony's helpful move, and for weeks the Senate, led by the great orator Marcus Tullius Cicero, praised Antony for his actions, calling him an honorable savior of the Republic. The people were not so happy, though, and the Senate happily appointed Antony a bodyguard to prevent any violence upon his person. Appian writes of what happened next. Quote, Antony, either because he had done everything for this purpose or seizing the happy chance, enlisted his guard till it amounted to 6,000. They were not common soldiers either. These were comprised wholly of centurion officers." End quote. In other words, Antony now literally had a highly trained army at his fingertips around Rome. And it was with this military presence and consular power that Marc Antony began to show his true colors. Antony now went after the Senate and most especially launched political attacks on the conspirators. Thus, Antony bullied the Senate into stripping Cassius of his Syrian governorship and also stripped Marcus Brutus of Macedonia. Although the Senate did manage to keep Decimus Brutus as the governor of Cisalpine Gaul and the commander of the 3 legions stationed in northern Italia and southern Gaul. By the letter of the law, though, Brutus and Cassius were not actually stripped of their provinces, they were instead relegated to far smaller provinces of little importance, like Crete, for example. Sorry if you're from Crete, by the way. But Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius had suspected Antony for some time and had been in contact with their friends and colleagues in the eastern provinces of the Republic. Plutarch and Appian then tell us that Marcus Brutus and Cassius, where they began to raise money, supplies, and an army for their impending conflict with Antony. Unbeknownst to basically everybody, however, was Octavian, who had just arrived in the Italian coastal city of Brundisium. And it was upon his arrival with his friend Marcus Agrippa that Octavian finally made his decision. For upon his arrival in Italia, Octavian was greeted by former veteran soldiers of Caesar. They treated him as the rightful son of Julius and presented to Octavian a copy of Caesar's will. Upon reading it, Octavian stated that he would move on Rome and claim his inheritance. Thereafter, he also made a point of referring to himself only by the name of Caesar. Octavian then asked for the loyalty of the Roman soldiers, and they readily pledged themselves to the young Caesar. He also sent messages to Marc Antony asking for his hand in friendship and his assistance in claiming his rightful inheritance. Antony ignored his messages, however, and Octavian moved for Rome in late April 44 BCE with a small force. Octavian and Agrippa made quite sure to march slowly, though, to announce Octavian to all of Italia as the rightful heir and son of Julius Caesar. Their retinue of veteran soldiers grew as they approached Rome, and whispers of Caesar's son began to spread around the Republic. He arrived in late April or near the calends of May, and despite his growing presence, neither Antony nor the Senate paid the young Caesar much attention. It was actually upon his arrival that Octavian Caesar learned of all the political happenings between Antony, the Senate, and the conspirators. He also received word that the Senate, on the approval of Marc Antony as well, had recalled from exile Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey the Great. The Senate had also appointed Sextus Pompey as commander of Rome's naval operations. The young Caesar was quite taken aback by these deeds, many of which he considered to be disgraceful maneuvers to his father Julius Caesar. And Octavian said as much to the people, and the people greatly approved. Octavian did not yet go on the offensive, however. He first called for a face-to-face meeting with Marc Antony in hopes of creating an alliance. He was finally able to obtain this meeting, and several sources note that Octavian was pointedly kept waiting. Such an insult proved to be an omen of their future relationship. The meeting proved to be contentious. Antony greatly insulted and disregarded Octavian, for he treated the young Caesar as just a young boy too deep in waters he did not understand. The most important result of the initial meeting, though, was Antony's refusal to acknowledge Octavian's adoption and his refusal to give Octavian his rightful inheritance. Antony would soon learn the hard way that Octavian, though young, was well equipped for public life and a shrewd politician in the making. Antony's response was a substantial setback, but Octavian continued on despite his lack of inheritance. Even more dangerous was Antony's next move. He had the people's assemblies grant him the governorship of Macedonia after his term as consul was done. This gave Antony control over a strong province and, more importantly, command of 5 legions. The Senate greatly disapproved, but they could not stop the legislation within the people's assemblies. Soon after all this, Octavian sought support and friends elsewhere. He went to the Senate and lesser assemblies and began soliciting friends and help, most especially from Marcus Cicero, and Cicero was most willing to assist the young Caesar as long as it weakened Antony's position. Octavian also publicly declared that he was going to put on and completely finance celebratory games in honor of his father Julius Caesar. For this, the people of Rome were ecstatic, and the young Caesar began to accrue great renown. These games were set for late June and July, but that was not all, because Octavian knew that Caesar had also left roughly 300 sestertii to every plebeian in Rome in his will. That is some very substantial pocket change, by the way, but what is most important is that the people were oblivious to this fact because Antony had been stalling the verification of Caesar's will. So in a deliberate political move, Octavian publicly announced to the people what Antony was holding back from not only himself, but from them. Thus the people became even more inclined to Octavian and held even more contempt for the machinations of Marc Antony. Around this time in early summer 44, a tribune of the people died while in office, requiring the election of a replacement. A tribune is a representative of the people, mainly the plebeians, and had the power of veto on a great amount of legislation. I bring this election up because the people proclaimed that Octavian should put his name in for election as tribune, although it is quite possible that Octavian himself began such rumors. This was actually not even legally possible because patricians could not run for the office of tribune, but that was not the point. When Marc Antony heard of Octavian's political maneuvers, he was infuriated and publicly blocked Octavian's election for office, as well as throwing insults at the young Caesar. This was exactly what Octavian wanted, however, to curry the favor of the plebeians of Rome, and playing the victim worked like a charm. Yet Octavian was still not done, for he announced in the Roman Forum that he was putting all of his land holdings up for sale in order to fulfill his father's promise of 300 sestertii to the downtrodden of Rome. And one thing that I would like you to keep in mind throughout all of Octavian's actions is that he is doing all of this without the ratification of Caesar's will. Meaning Octavian is spending money he doesn't have because he does not yet have official access to the personal treasury of his father Julius Caesar. As you might imagine, that is quite the precarious position, and no doubt a stressful position to be in, so keep that in mind as you think on everything Octavian is doing during his first year in Roman politics. It is really quite astonishing. And thus, through his act of apparent selflessness, Octavian was not only doing his duty to his father, but circumventing Antony's political stall tactics through his personal charity. Thereby, Octavian had the favor of the people and the Senate by midsummer. One thing he did not have just yet that Antony certainly did was an army. With the name of Caesar, though, he hoped he would be able to garner their favor. So throughout the summer months, Octavian began to invoke the name of Caesar throughout the Italian peninsula, especially in nearby Campania. On several occasions going out on his own from city to city with his right-hand man Marcus Agrippa. Throughout these tours, Octavian stirred up old loyalties by declaring that his father required avenging and that Antony was not going after his father's murderers, but he, his father's son, would avenge his father's murder by going after every single one of the murderers without mercy. And the name of Caesar proved incredibly powerful and effective. By the end of the summer of 44, Octavian had invoked the loyalty of some 10,000 soldiers, and the young Caesar placed his developing army near Rome. By this time, Marc Antony also began to remaneuver himself as well. Antony already had the future governorship of Macedonia, but he now wanted to deprive Decimus Brutus of Cisalpine Gaul by having his governorship transferred to Cisalpine Gaul instead of Macedonia. Antony wanted to do this for several reasons. Reason number 1, to remove Decimus Brutus, one of the murderers of Julius Caesar, from a position of power. Reason number 2, Cisalpine Gaul was a good leverage position due to its proximity to Rome and the Senate. Reason number 3, Cisalpine Gaul was home to several Roman legions, and Antony wanted to transfer the 5 legions from Macedonia into Cisalpine Gaul in order to control the bulk of the Roman army. By having such immense control over the military, Antony hoped to solidify his place and control over the Senate and the Republic at large. As you might imagine, the Senate, led by Cicero, was loudly against this move by Antony, but it was no use because the governorship change that Antony requested was decided by the Army Assembly, not the Senate. So indeed, Antony did get what he wanted. He would be governor of Cisalpine Gaul in the following year, and Antony then took his leave from Rome to Macedonia, where he took command of the legions as he prepared to move come the new year. As Antony did that, Octavian finally put on his July Games, and he advertised them as the funeral games for his father Julius Caesar. They proved to be a very fruitful measure on many levels because Octavian seemed extremely generous and benevolent for his sponsoring of the free games, but the games also proved to be very well timed. For a great astronomical event occurred for at least a week during July 44 BCE. Yes, a massive comet hung in the sky day and night for over a week during the funeral games of Julius Caesar. Quickly, everyone took this to be a sign from the gods, and Suetonius writes, quote, "A comet shone for 7 successive days, rising about the 11th hour, and was believed to be the soul of Caesar." End quote. In other words, the people believed that they were witnessing the transcendence of Julius Caesar's soul to the pantheon of the gods. They were witnessing Julius Caesar's deification. Octavian witnessed this as well and quickly understood what to do. He praised his father in a great oration and asked for everyone to pray for his father, who had clearly just become a Roman god. Not only that, though, Octavian announced that he, as a dutiful son, would build a temple to the divine Julius Caesar in the Roman Forum. The people hailed Octavian as the son of Caesar, calling him Caesar reincarnate. But more important than that, Octavian was now being hailed as the son of a god. That is it for this episode. Stay tuned for the continued story of Augustus Caesar, and if you have any questions, comments, corrections, or concerns, send them my way at everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.